do a review of Lekuta Sichas, Chelek Tazbov, the second sicha for the Parsha of Toldos. In this sicha, there's going to be a very detailed, interesting discussion about the status of Eretz Yisrael before the Yidden actually entered the Eretz Yisrael during the time of Abraham. Did Abraham really own it then? There's a difference between the Medrash and Rashi's approach, and also ties into the fact why Yitzchak was not supposed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Either it is because of the Kedusha, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, he's not allowed to, shouldn't be leaving that, or it is because the outside of Eretz Yisrael is not deserving of him. So this is a difference between Rashi and the Medrash, and the Rebbe will explain this all in great detail. So let's look inside. Aleph. From Pasuk Vayero Elov Hashem Vayomer. In the verse, Hashem appeared to him, to Yitzchak, and he says to him, Al Tered Mitzrayim, do not descend to Egypt. Shchoin ba'oretz asher eimer elecha. Rest, live in the place that I tell you. Gur ba'oretz hazois, live in this land. State in Medrash, so the Medrash says, why did Hashem say, Gur ba'oretz hazois, you live in this land? Amar Rabbi Hoshaya, so Rabbi Hoshaya said, At oilo timimo, you are a complete oila, a korban, like a korban oila that went up onto the mizbeach. You are an oila timimo. Ma oila, just like an oila, the korban. Im yotza schut the kiloim hinifselas. If it goes outside of the curtains, those are the curtains that surrounded the Azorah, the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan, hinifselas, that would be disqualified. You're not allowed to have kachim go outside. Avat, so to you, so about Yitzchak, since you're an oila, im yatzos chutz la'aretz nifzelas. You outside of your curtain, your area is Eretz Yisrael. If you go out of there, you become disqualified. So therefore, even though, as Rashi brings down, he had a mind, just like when there was a hunger earlier in the time of Avraham. Avraham went down to Mitzrayim, so also Yitzchak had a thought to go to Mitzrayim. The Eibusha tells him, Gur ba'aretz hazois, you have to stay in Eretz Yisrael, because you're an oila. An oila cannot go outside of its partition. Your partition is Eretz Yisrael, you can't go. If you go outside, you become disqualified. But Rashi, if you look, says a little bit different. Rashi b'pirusha of the Verter, on these words, he says, Al Tered Mitzrayim. Don't go down to Mitzrayim. And he explains the words not to go down to Mitzrayim, as the Rebbe will explain in a minute. Is mefarish. He had in mind to descend to Egypt, Yorad Aviv Bimei Harov, just like his father during the days of the hunger descended to Mitzrayim. Amar loy, so Hashem told to him, Al Tered, don't go out, don't descend. Eibusha tells him, Al Tered Mitzrayim, Sha'ata Oilo Timimo, you are an Oilo Timimo, a complete Oilo, and outside of Eretz Yisrael is not fitting for you. It almost seems like Rashi and the Medrash say the same thing. That's the way the Ram learns. The Ram learns that Rashi, what is saying here is really the words of the Medrash. The Ram learned in Pirush Rashi. The Ram learns in Rashi's commentary. Since he is a complete oilo, which is Holy of Holies, is Kol Ha'aretz Ba'im. So then, relative to Yitzchak, the entire Eretz Yisrael, Al Derech V'Da'azor L'Gabe Kodesh Kodashim, is similar like the courtyard relative to the Kodesh Kodashim, still holy. That's where the korban is brought. So Yitzchak needs to be in the Azorah inside of Eretz Yisrael. Un Chutz La'aretz, quoting from the Ram, Chashuvei Etzloi ki Chutz min Azorah. Chutz La'aretz is considered by Yitzchak as outside of the courtyard of Ein Kodesh Kodoshim, but things that are holy of holiest, like the Korban Oila, Yoitze L'chutz min Azorah, you can't take them outside of the Azorah. The difference between Kochim Kalim can be in Yerushalayim. Kochim Kodoshim need to be in the Azorah. But relative to the Kochim, which need to be in the Azorah, is the same thing, all of Eretz Yisrael relative to the Kochim Kodoshim, to the Oila of Yitzchak. If you do go outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's not going to help you to come back. You become disqualified, and it becomes eternally disqualified, usher forever. So basically, that's what you're not allowed to leave, which is the way he learns Rashi is the same as it says in the Medrash. So according to the interpretation of Rabbi Yoel Mizrahi, it turns out, as Rashi is oisen to mefader sein auf denselben Eufen mit der Medrash Hanal, Rashi is here to explain the same way as the above mentioned. But the Rebbe says, if you look, you will see there's two difference. There are two different interpretations. According to the Medrash, he needs to stay in Eretz Yisrael. But according to Rashi, he needs to not go out of Eretz Yisrael. It needs not to be in Chutz La'aretz. Over there, you have to stay in Eretz Yisrael. According to the Medrash, according to Rashi, you should not be in Chutz La'aretz. The Medrash explains it on the words Gur Ba'aretz Hazois, why you have to be there. Rashi explains it on Al-Teded, why you shouldn't leave. Let's look inside. Kadaik is Shapir. Well, when you look at it well, Zetman Ober, you see, however, as Svishan Pirush Rashi and Pirush HaMedrash, that between the Rashi commentary and the Medrash commentary, there are such changes, was bringing Arois Ashinui. They also bring out a change from the Perush, also in the contents of the meaning. It's not just some wordage change over here, but it's actually a different idea as represented by the Medrash and Rashi. Aleph. Number one, Loita Medrash is Yitzchak's Yitzia in Chutz La'aretz verbunden mit Absul. According to the Medrash, Yitzchak going out to Chutz La'aretz is tied to a disqualification. Im Yotzos Chutz La'aretz nifsalta. If you go out to Chutz La'aretz, you have become disqualified. Punkt. Just as a Korban Oila that goes outside of the curtains, outside of the Azorah of the Beis HaMikdash, is disqualified. But Rashi b'Perushi is madgish. No, Rashi only in his emphasis only as ein Chutz La'aretz kedailach. It's not worthy for you. It doesn't say you're going to become disqualified. Base. And the other difference is, in Medrash is the drosha of the Verter Gur Ba'aretz Hazois. In the Medrash, the expounding is on the words "live in this land." Explains why he has to be in the land. Or Rashi stellt sich auf the Verter, but Rashi places himself on the words "Al teiret Mitzrayim," don't go down to Egypt. Was von the beide Shinuyim was ein Toldos zeh. From these two changes, which are hinged one on another. That's why, because the Medrash explains the first part, why it's live in this land, and Rashi explains the second part, why not to go out. That's why they give different reasons. Is moving as is achiluk b'toichna pirushim, that there is also a difference in the contents of these interpretations. Loite Medrash, according to the Medrash, is by Yitzchak that Isur Yitzia lechutz la'aretz. Why is it for Yitzchak prohibited to go outside the chutz la'aretz? It's a teitzah, it's a result. It's an outcome from them was in Eretz Yisrael. Why don't go out is because you got to be in Eretz Yisrael. Gur Ba'aretz Hazois. He has to be in Eretz Yisrael, and because he has to be in Eretz Yisrael, he can't go out. Mitzad der Ma'il from Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael has an advantage. That's why you have to be in Eretz Yisrael. You can't go out. But Eretz Yisrael legabe Yitzchak, because Eretz Yisrael relative to Yitzchak is v'toich hakloim legabe ha'oila, is just like being inside of the curtains in the Chotzer, in the Azorah, relative to an oil. And therefore, is im yotzosa chutz la'aretz nifsalta. You go out from the place where you need to be, from Eretz Yisrael, you become disqualified. Well, it is Eretz from Eretz Yisrael because he left Eretz Yisrael. That's according to the Medrash. According to Rashi, however, is the Shlilas HaYitziyah from Yitzchak, the negation. Why Yitzchak cannot? Why do we negate Yitzchak from leaving? It's tied not with their Mailim Yechedus Eretz Yisrael. It's not with the distinction, the special advantage of Eretz Yisrael. Nor midem chisorim v'chutz la'aretz. That is because of the lackings and the inferiority, the less of what is in chutz la'aretz. Ein chutz la'aretz kedai loch. Chutz la'aretz is not fitting for you. Und der Riber is das verbunden. That's why it's connected. Nicht mit the chiv kur b'aretz azois. Not you should need to stay in the land. Nor with the shlila. It's only with the negative. Don't go to Egypt. Al tered Mitzrayim. It's not so much that we need you in Eretz Yisrael, but we don't want you to be in Chutz La'aretz. According to Rashi, Yitzchak is not supposed to be in Chutz La'aretz. Al tered Mitzrayim. That's the main thing, and that's why he stays in Eretz Yisrael. According to the Medrash, he has to stay in Eretz Yisrael, and that's why you can't go out. So what's the difference? So the Rebbe says it would seem that the difference is that according to Rashi, we could explain Eretz Yisrael didn't have any kedusha in the time of Avraham Yitzchak, and Yaakov, time of the Av, didn't have any kedusha, and therefore we can't say, according to Rashi, that he needs to stay. Somehow there's an advantage of Eretz Yisrael that it's considered like inside of the Kloyim, and that's why Rashi has to say the only thing Chutz La'aretz is not deserving him. But Mashen Kein, according to the Medrash, there was already a Chalois Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael from the time of Avraham. Let's look inside. Base. It seems like we could seemingly explain the reason of the change between Rashi and the Medrash. Leuten Medrash is das verbunden mit Kedushas Haaretz. According to the Medrash, this Avraham staying in Eretz Yisrael is tied to the sanctity of the land. Eretz Yisrael is Mukadeshes Mikol Ha'arotzis. Eretz Yisrael is more holy from all other lands. And the Yitziyah from Yitzchak and the exit of Yitzchak is geglichen to the Yitziyah, is equated to the exit from an Oila Chutz Mikdushas Hazorah, to an Oila that goes outside of the sanctity of the Hazorah. Just like an oil going out of the koloim is disqualified. So you, if you go outside of Eretz Yisrael, you become disqualified. So that's according to the Medrash. He explains its simple meaning is in in the simple level, reading the literal level of the pasuk. We don't find as Eretz Yisrael Bizman HaOves, that Eretz Yisrael during the time of the forefathers, that is not given Eretz Canaan while it be still the land of Canaan, that it should have in itself a kedusha. We don't find that the Riber, and therefore Rashi says, as I need a rizgen in Chutz La'aretz, that the reason he should not go out in outside of Eretz Yisrael is ikroi. The main thing is it's not that there's something special to live in that land, because that mitzat kedushas haaretz, that there's some sanctity in the land. Rashi doesn't interpret like that because there's no kedusha according to Rashi. Nor mitzad dem chisorim from chutz la'aretz, there is a lacking in chutz la'aretz. Chutz la'aretz is not the good place. And chutz la'aretz, k'tayloch chutz la'aretz is not fitting, not worthy for you. The Rebbe is going to explain now that even according to the Medrash, we can't just say that in Eretz Yisrael there was a Kedusha in the time of the Ovis. The Rebbe introduces this. In Emes Ober Kemer Hazonit Lenin, we can't say that this is the difference between Rashi and the Medrash, that according to the Medrash, it was already had a sanctity. So Behagdim Hashayla first by introducing a question. This whole idea of Yitzchak not leaving, we find already before when Eliezer asked, should he let Yitzchok move back to the land that he came from? So he says, no, don't send him back there. But we don't find that he gave it a reason that Yitzchok has to be in the land of Canaan. This whole discussion there. So why don't we have that discussion over there? And the Rebbe says, because we can't say at that time that there was a Kedusha. So that's why we don't find this reason over there. Let's look inside. So the Inyan as Yitzchok, so there is given Eretz Yisrael, this idea that Yitzchok should not go out of Eretz Yisrael, we find this earlier. When Avram had geschickt Eliezer in the Chutz Loretz, when Avram sent Eliezer to outside of Eretz Yisrael, El Arzi going to my land, Yitzchok should take a son, a wife for my son Yitzchok. Is Oif Eliezer Shaila. So when Eliezer asked him, Ulai Loisevo Isha Goimer, maybe the woman will refuse to go Eloretz Hazois to this land. He wants to stay there. Should I return your son there? Avram answered him, be very careful to you, don't, lest you bring my son back there. So he told him, don't send him. Why not? Over there, we don't find any commentary. Ados is to leave them, was Yitzchak is given an Eilo Tamima, because Yitzchak is an Eilo Tamima, so whatever, he shouldn't go back because he has to stay in Eretz Yisrael, etc. We don't find that. So the Rebbe uses this as a proof. It seems that that's not the case. Now, the Rebbe says, well, maybe we have another explanation why it was okay, even if he's an Oila Tamima, he shouldn't go to Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it was okay according to Halacha, because an exception for leaving Eretz Yisrael is to getting married. You seem like you can maybe answer is the way of Halacha, why there was no problem sending Yitzchak and back outside of Eretz Yisrael, and no, he didn't. He said that don't bring him back there. Why there was a problem? Because to go marry a wife, you can't stay there permanently. You have to come back, unless there's a reason. Let's see inside. The din is the halacha is as also losses from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz Loretz la'olam. You're never allowed to leave from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz Loretz. Elalilma Torah lisisha, unless you're going to somewhere you can get special study of Torah in Chutz Loretz or marrying a wife. And also, if you go out to learn Torah, is there no v'yachzal oretz? Is you have to go back to the land. Avo lishkoi b'chutz loretz, but to permanently less than chutz loretz also is prohibited. Elinke, the exception is chazak shemarov. There is a great hunger in chutz loretz. Ad shenasa shavadin chitim mishnei dinorim, to the extent that what is usually the value of a dinner, you can buy chitim for that amount, now doubled in price, that is considered hunger, and then you can leave. So one can answer, well, why is it not a problem why did he tell him not to go? The Riber, in Parshas Chayis sort of with the Shaila from Eliezer, in Parshas over the question of Eliezer, was Hashiv has been shall I return your son to the land that you have come from there? Hot gemeint, that meant as Yitzchak soll verbleiben dort bikvies, that he should remain there permanently. Nicht not on the understanding that he will come back with Baltas Leitova Isha because the woman doesn't want. He's verstandig, for was das is given abgefragt. That's understood why this was totally unacceptable. Und Avram hat ihm angesagt, he told him, instructed him, be very careful lest you bring my son back there. As opposed in our portion, we're talking about a hunger in the land. Then there is no isur of above to leaving to Chutz Loretz. So therefore, as we see that Avraham, our father, also did so in the days of hunger. He went because when there's a hunger, you're allowed to. So over there, we understand why he doesn't want him to go there, because you're not allowed to leave Chutz La'aretz permanently. But for hunger, you're allowed to leave. So over here, the Eibster has to tell him, no, the Riber, the Eibster, no, your exception, even the hunger, you have to stay here. As Yitzchak is not allowed to leave because of a special reason. Those of us said he's an Oila Tmima because he's an Oila Tmima, complete Oila. So he has to stay, notwithstanding the normal allowance for leaving there. And that's what would explain to us why don't we find the Oila Tmima argument over there, because over there it wasn't needed, because over there Eliezer wanted Yitzchak to move permanently. The question was to move him permanently, and that's not allowed. So but it's difficult to interpret it in such a way. The Rambam concludes that halacha that we quoted before, in the Rebbe the Monta halacha, the previous halacha mentioned, quote, even though it is permissible to leave, that is not the measure of Chassidus righteousness. That means Shari brings out the evidence, Shari Machlin, the Kilyan, the story with Elimelech and Rus. They were Shnei Gdei Lahadoir Hoyu, they were two great of the generation. And there was a great problem, there was a hunger in the land, and that's why they left. And yet they were guilty of destruction. They both died for Hashem. It's a simon that you're still not supposed to go. So it means that leaving Eretz Yisrael, even for such a reason, is not an acceptable reason. So the Rebbe says, so if we should really say that the law of leaving Eretz Yisrael was applicable even in the times of Avraham, that still had that kedusha and you shouldn't leave, like we have the din in the Rambam in our days, so then it doesn't really add up. Would Avraham not do the midas chasidus, and he would leave because of Rav? When the Rambam he says that you shouldn't leave, it's a midas chasidus. If we should say as the din that the conceptually the prohibition of going out chutz laretz by the others that also apply to the others, akoponim. We don't mean that they were afke mechuyev, but mitzad them was kima others kol ha'Torah kula achlein. No, they did fulfill all the Torah even prior to it given. Afilu achilas matzah, they ate matzah, as we see in the parasha matzahs offered. Afilu gzeirus which was in the Rabbanon, and there was gzeirus was in the Rabbanon, tchumim. And the Rabbanon the halachas, as Rashi brings down, that we read in the notes, so for sure they would have been careful and they would have also been careful not leaving Eretz Yisrael, outside of Eretz Yisrael, to leave Eretz Yisrael. This is not a measure of Chassidus. We see it's also tied with such a great punishment, God forbid, like Machlin and Kilyan. So, notwithstanding that it's just Chassidus, and you're allowed to, but still the sin and the penalties are pretty severe. So, if there is really a problem with going out in the times of the others, then they wouldn't do it. And further, and main thing is, Avraham Avinu is a ruis from Eretz Yisrael tzuriki chorim, that Avraham Avinu left Eretz Yisrael back to Choron, noch Bris Ben Absorim, after the Bris Ben Absorim, afilu nit nazman von Rov, not even in the time of hunger. As the Rebbe points out in the Ha'or over here, different places over there, the different things that Rashi brings that, but we see that he left. The Rebbe debates whether that was an allowance or not. The bottom line is it doesn't really fit for Avram to leave Eretz Yisrael if there was a problem, if there was an Israel in Eretz Yisrael. But the truth is, the Rebbe said, the truth is, them is mukhrach. From this, it's evident. Abizmana Ovis is nichayich given der Isur Yitzir from Eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz. The time of the forefather, it didn't apply that prohibition against leaving Eretz Yisrael to chutz la'aretz. B'meiloich nichayich, and also it did not apply as the Ovis on Zayin Nizer in them that the forefather should be careful in this. Although they fulfilled, observed the entire Torah before it was given. While they get there from Kedushas Ha'oretz, the definition of what sanctity of the land as far as it relates to leaving Eretz Yisrael and saying, well, Eretz Yisrael is Kodesh, you can't leave it, then it did not apply. This is euch verstandig, this is also understood, wasn't wholly relative with regards to not being allowed to leave it. This is euch verstandig for Maimon HaMechilta. This is also understood from the saying of the Mechilta. Eretz Yisrael, before Eretz Yisrael was chosen, all the lands were kosher of Hashem speaking. Only after Eretz Yisrael was chosen, then excludes all the lands that the dibres, the speech comes only, the Hashem speaking comes only in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, can't say anything has to do. He didn't want him to send Yitzchak because didn't want Yitzchak to go live back in the place over there because of the prohibition of leaving Eretz Yisrael. So what's the reason? He told Eliezer, be careful lest you bring my son back there. That's also understood even simply on the literal level. From the words Avram said, in the flow, as the verses continue, Hashem who has sworn to me, saying, that to your seed, I'll give this land. Baldos is the land. Was the Eberstevetov given to Yitzchak? So Yitzchak, this is the land that God is going to give to Yitzchak. Hotnit kinor, so it doesn't make, there's no room for, as Yitzchak told to leave Lisa Isha, that to marry a wife, Avegim fun Ir, to leave his land, to leave the place, and to sell the chutzlot when that's what Hashem is giving to his seed. So over there we don't need any explanation. Over there it's evidence of the simple meaning of the pasuk. As opposed to our parsha, in which we're dealing with a case that there was a hunger in the land. There's no other choice, but you have to leave the land. So little, simply, it's logical. This should not hold back to prevent from temporary to go in an order in a place where there is food, until the time the hunger is over. So therefore, there's a special reason. Unless there's a special reason. Yitzchak is an Eila Tmima, and therefore he can't go. Okay. So the question remains there that we started off. We wanted to explain before that he shouldn't go out because of the Kedusha, because of Eretz Yisrael, but Avram went, and there's no that didn't apply that. So does Eretz Yisrael noch demos nicht given? So Eretz Yisrael was not yet at that time distinguished, separated with its special sanctity. So how does it help that since he's an Eila Tmima, can go out? Especially according to the emphasis, the Medrash says, just like an Eila becomes possible, he also become possible. What is there about Eretz Yisrael? There is going to say that according to the Medrash, even though it didn't have the full kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, but Eretz Yisrael, according to the Medrash, was already given ownership to Avram, as opposed to, according to Rashi, even the ownership didn't take place then. Gimel. We can say, and by introducing yet another change, because we can find that we find sufficient Aloshon Rashi and Aloshon Medrash, the language that Rashi uses and the language that's used by the Medrash. If the passing by Bris ben Absorim on the verse which Hashem gave him in the covenant amongst the pieces in the Parshas Lech Lecha, when Hashem tells Avraham, makes the covenant, says by Yomahu Koros Hashem es Avraham Bris Leimer. Hashem formed a covenant with Avraham, saying, and listen, the language is Lizaracha Nosati es Oretz Hazois. I have given. It doesn't say Lizaracha Ete. It says Lizaracha Nosati es Oretz. I have given to them this land. So state in Medrash. So the Medrash says, "My Morish Lakodesh Baruch Hu Ma'isa." Hashem saying is an action. Shenemar, the pasuk says Lizaracha Nosati. Just the fact that Hashem says, "I will give," it's like done. He's given already. Ete es Oretz Hazois Ein Sivkan. It doesn't say I will give. I have given this land. That's the Medrash. But Rashi, when he explains Zarach Nasati, he translates it as Amiroshe Shalakadosh Baruch Hu ki ilu hi asuya. It doesn't say it is a ma'isa, but it says if it's done. What does it come out? As the Dasa Medrash, according to the Medrash, is by Brisbane Avsorim given the Maisa Nisina, by the covenant that took place between the pieces by Abraham. So over there, the act of giving was already happened. It was an act. When Hashem said, "I'm going to give you," I was already given. So he says, "Nasati." And then it was acquired. It was acquired by Abraham and a seed after. Gans Eretz Yisrael, the entire Eretz Yisrael. So basically, Eretz Yisrael was acquired to Avram and the seed afterwards, all of Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Bris Ben Absorim. But this is Yerushalmi. This also fits with the saying of the Yerushalmi. As Lizarach Nasati, that I've given to your seed, is not havtoch, it's not a promise. Nor kvar nasati, it was given as belonging to the Eden. Noch Eider in Eretz Yisrael, even prior to them entering Eretz Yisrael. And Azoy also fits with them, as the Gemara sagt, what the Gemara says, La Loche, as Eretz Yisrael Muchazekasi. Eretz Yisrael has been already established and held on to by Yerushi Lachem Avesechem. It is an inheritance from your father. So that means that it was already theirs. That is according to the Medrash. The Rashi, as opposed to according to Rashi, the saying of Hashem did not accomplish the Maisa and the Sin of Mamish, the act of giving in actuality. As Eretz Yisrael is all from them unbelonging to Eden, that Eretz Yisrael should have from then on belong to Eden. Says nor it's only as Amiroseh Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem saying is ki ilu hi asuya, is as if it is done, but not done. Aber euch mitzad them, but also, even though it's not mamash given, is masim, it's fitting, even in the literal level of the pasuk, to zogen them loshen, we can still say, Lezerachon asati that I have given. So, since according to the Medrash, it's already bought and acquired to Avraham, why not also the Kedusha? So why do we say that it didn't have Kedusha then? And that's why Avraham left Eretz Yisrael. Since we say, according to the view of the Medrash and Halacha, that it impacts the actual land, as that it was acquired by to Avram and his seed after him. Why should we also not say that it also impacted and it became holy? The sanctity in the land was also impacted through the acquisition. He said to him, even more than this, since we find as gleich shebara olam is Bachar Eretz Yisrael, soon as Hashem created the world, He chose Eretz Yisrael to be the land for the Yidden. Is doch Mokum Leimer, so there's room to say, as from them Multon, it was given an Eretz Kedosh, that from then on it was a holy land. And therefore applies to it all matters that the sanctity of the land obligates, which means brings with it. That should include even the prohibition against exiting Eretz Yisrael. Even if you're not an Elut Mimah like Yitzchak, why would you be allowed to go out? And here we're saying Elut Mimah. And the Rebbe is going to explain that until Matan Torah, objects did not become holy. Eretz Yisrael could not become holy before Matan Torah because the holiness could not penetrate in Chefza, in the object. Hey, Dalet. We can say the explanation of this. Shengeret Filmo, spoken many times, but again, the mitzvahs was the obvious of Mekayim event with regards to those mitzvahs that the forefathers observed before the Torah was given. When the mitzvahs was sitting on Mekayim noch Matan Torah, and the mitzvahs that Yidden observe after Matan Torah, there's a difference. As a Baal der Kima mitzvahs far Matan Torah is given by Oifen, since the observance of the mitzvah before Matan Torah was in a way. For they were not commanded by Hashem and they were doing it. The mitzvahs that had them, those mitzvahs did not have the power to mishana zayin them to change the essence of the item that was created of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You could not impact a change without doing a mitzvah that Hashem told you. You cannot change a fact, a created thing that Hashem created, and make it to something else than it was created. Mishana zayin them gufa dover, to change the body of the item with the mitzvah with which you've done the mitzvah. As a zover nachaftzah shel mitzvah, you should become an object of a mitzvah. The mitzvah only impacted the person. The oiftu from kima mitzvah is given. The accomplishment of the observance of the mitzvah was nor b'shayches from gavra, only as it relates to the person. Mekayim mitzvah, the one who's doing the mitzvah. But after the Torah was given, and after HaKadosh Baruch command, through the observance of mitzvahs, in their chefza, there's a change in the object. As the chefza verta chefetz mitzvah kedusha, the object becomes an object of a mitzvah and holy. Was there tam deroivis versteht in Medrash? What's the reason that now it changes? Because Matan Torah brought down by Yered Hashem, it broke the boundaries between the top and the bottom, between Hashem above and below, and we can change the metzias of below. Was there tam deroivis versteht in Medrash? The reason why it could not accomplish before Matan Torah is state the Medrash. As far Matan Torah is given a gezeda, before the Torah was given, there was a decree as that the upper ones don't go down to the lower ones, and the lower ones go on to the upper ones. So we can't change the S and make something low to something high, and something high cannot come down and penetrate something low. But when the Torah was given, when the Hashem nullified that decree. That it should be able to be that fusion, that connection from the upper one to the supreme with the low. That's haste. That means that Tzibur Matan Torah, the command that took place when Hashem gave the Torah at Oiv Giton, that accomplished them together for Chefza, the mitzvah, Aveda, that made an object of a mitzvah and Aveda in the Yoneh Ha'olam, in world matters. Afila Eider that mentions Mekayim Mitzvah mitzvah, even before the person does the actual mitzvah, as Everna Keli Muksher, they become a fitting vessel to Mekayim Zay mitzvah mitzvah and durchzeh, that you should do a mitzvah with them and through them. When durch them was their Odom is Mekayim, the mitzvah, when a person does this mitzvah in action, that nikva bepoil kedusha. So then you have setting in actuality, sanctity, which is el yonim, in the chayfetz shalamatin, an object below, which is tachtoinim. That is the el yonim tachtoinim. When the verta chefetz shel mitzvah kedusha chula, and it becomes an object either of a mitzvah object or a kedusha, the different levels. In a chefetz tashmish mitzvah, tashmish kedusha. Al derech zeh is moving over in Eretz Yisrael in a similar way. It's understood with regards to Eretz Yisrael. Choch as der kinyan of bailus of Eretz Yisrael, even though the acquisition and the ownership of Eretz Yisrael also has been accomplished before the Torah was given, through Hashem's speech. But then the resting of the sanctity, also the sanctity which is not through mitzvahs, the creation itself, like the cheptza itself, that could not be stationed, set into the object for the orders in life. After Matan Torah, however, even before conquering, is in Irnis Chadish der Geder and Efsharius HaKadusha, then it has become renewed, this novelty, that the definition and the possibilities for Kedusha, because Hashem says that you should conquer it, so that tzivu alone changes the essence of the land. And when they actually conquered it, is in the nikva they set the Kedusha. So when the tzivui came, it got the potential that it could change into Eretz Yisrael, and when they conquered it, it actually changed. So that's the answer. Why was there no Isra Yitzir Chutz La'aretz? Because there could not be Kedusha penetrated over there. And the Rebbe wants to take the same idea with regards to the ownership of Eretz Yisrael according to Rashi. Even though we said that according to Rashi, Eretz Yisrael had only a potential. So this will be explained in a similar way. Hey, just as the Medrash, we explained as it relates to the sanctity of the land, that it wasn't able yet at that time to be Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, the Chefza could not become Kedusha. Similar is according to Rashi's view in this literal level of the pasuk, as far as it relates to the acquisition of the ownership in the land of Eretz Yisrael. Bibald as der Eufen vegeder nesinas haaretz from the Ebershon to Eden. Since the way and the definition of giving the land from Hashem to the Eden is nit wie es wird gegeben as Zach von Astam Neisen zu Astam Akabel. It's not like just an ordinary person that gives something and he receives it. You give something, you just changed one place to the other place, you can change it back. Here it was given permanent giving. But the Nesina is not Ashin Rishus. When you give ordinarily, you're just changing whose possession, whose ownership, in whose domain is it. Was by Baitni dem Hus von dem Dovranit, it doesn't change the essence of the one thing that item was given. And therefore, can the Bailus of the Zach bottle? So then that ownership to the other person can later on be nullified and it can leave. Other person makes a kinyan, other kibush, other congregates. Can go from one to another one. So when I gave you, when a person gives something else to another person, there's no permanence in there. Somebody else can come and buy it later on. But the Eibishter is different. The Eibishter, Hashem gave even the essence of Eretz Yisrael to the Yidden. He removed and took away any connection to Eretz Yisrael from other nations. Nobody can get it. He gave it in an oifun. He gave it in a way as his gevor nashin nir mahus. It became a change in its essence. The chefza from the Eretz Yisrael is gevor durch HaKadosh Baruch Hu Eretz Yisrael. the object of this land, from that Eretz, it became, when Hashem gave it, Eretz Yisrael. So that is an object of Eretz Yisrael. Und von dem on kennen sie nicht gehören zu einem anderen Volk. From that point on, it cannot be owned by any other relation. Cannot change the ownership, the domain, by either make acquisition gates by. That cannot change the essence of this item. The Mela. So therefore, Bedug must close together a kedusha, similar to the general boundaries of kedusha. That can only be accomplished after the Torah was given. So even this can only be accomplished when Yidden actually conquered Eretz Yisrael to get that change of mahus. Rashi says in the beginning in the Chumash, you conquered the land of the seven nations. That is that transfer, that essence. Was damut givorim bepoil. Then it happened in actuality. He gave it to them and now gave it to us. So the giving it took place after the kibush. To giving the essence of the land, was since all the land is Hashem, He created it. At that time, it was given to us. And now the Rebbe goes back to explaining the chiluk. This is the chiluk Medrash and Rashi. We can explain the chiluk from Pirush Rashi and Medrash, the difference between the Rashi's commentary and the Medrash. This, that an oila is not permitted to be taken outside of the curtain, outside of the azora. If it leaves, it becomes disqualified. Is need to leave them gather kedusha. It's not because of the definition of the kedusha that we're saying that it's because of the kedusha of the azora. That it left to a place which is a lower level of kedusha. Not that it's outside of his boundaries. Everything has a boundary where it's supposed to be. Not necessarily because where it goes is a lesser level, but it's just not in its designed place. This is a general rule. Any time meat that would go outside of its boundaries would become treif. Them din learned up. Where do we learn this din that a bosser that goes out from posik ubosser basoda treifa loitechelu? Don't eat treifa. Treifa means that the meat has gone out into the soda. That's not the only holy meat. We're talking about generally that kibon sheyotza bosser chutz lemichitzosei neser, like by Eba Menachai. If it goes outside where it belongs, in that case in the mother's womb, then it becomes treifa. Hayois as their sub bosor hot zayin mach, as their sub bosor hot zayin mechitza. This has its boundary. What is magdir the mokum kavu v'ez b'lain? That is defines and makes boundaries in the set place that it belongs. The far is bosi kodesh kadoshim yotza chutz l'chaymas hazara. If you have meat which is kodesh kadoshim that goes outside of the boundary, the wall of the azara, that's the boundary is the azara. Kochim kalim, ubasar kochim kalim. Over there, it has to be in Yerushalayim. Sheyotza chutz l'chaymas Yerushalayim. That's its boundary. Or the basar haPesach sheyotza chutz l'chabarosei goes out of his grouping, becomes puzzle because the boundaries are the chabura. Or the anuber shoytzu yodei, or a fetus that takes out its hand, becomes treif because went out of that part went out of its boundaries. They become also loyal. Once the meat goes outside of its boundaries, nasa kitreifa becomes like a treifa. That's why the pasuk says basar basoda treifa. Going out makes it a treifa. Maisa, since the Medrash says that Hashem saying is a Maisa, Uner Tzisrael in Demut, sorry. And that's already then, from the time of the formed the covenant between the pieces, belong to the others, belong to the forefathers. The Riber Kumtois, therefore it turns out, as durch them der Eber started Yitzchak and Geis and sich makriv sein. Since Hashem instructed Yitzchak to offer himself as an oila tmima, as a complete oila, is b'derech memela Eretz Yisrael niga geworden als mekoyme. So Eretz Yisrael has been set as his place, u'mechitzos in his boundaries. B'dugma v'duch hakrovas oila v'er da'azori mokot mechitzo kavua. Similar to when you bring the oila, so the azora becomes its place and set mechitza, not because of kedusha, because of mechitza. That's why chutz is relative to Yitzchak. That would be going outside of the boundaries of his boundaries, Eretz Yisrael. That's Rashi, but as opposed to Rashi's opinion, Kinis Kalil, as mentioned earlier, as in Chefza from Eretz Yisrael, that in the object of Eretz Yisrael, this giving by the Brisbane Asorim did not accomplish. Rashi hat doch aber schon mefarish gemeint in Parshas Chayei Sorah. So basically, according to Rashi, there was no special boundaries over there because it did not accomplish yet then the potential, but it wasn't there. Rashi, however, did explain to Parshas Chayei Sorah in the Entwerf. So Eliezer told him, "Don't bring my son back there." The Verter says, "Hashem like when Avram said to him, to Eliezer, Hashem, the God of the heavens that took me from my father's home, and he said to him, now he is the God of the heavens and the earth, because I have trained them in the mouth of the created beings. But when he took me from my father's home, he was just the God of the heavens, not the God of the earth. The world people of the world did not recognize him, and his name wasn't common in the land. So he told him that there's a big difference between what's coming on and going on at Israel, not what it was. As they're spoken at length, the mitzvot Avram Masbir given to Eliezer. This was Avram's explanation to Eliezer, as in Chutz Loretz, based Ovi, that in Chutz Loretz, in my father's home, is the Eibishter B'leis L'kei Hashemayim. Over there, it's only L'kei Hashemayim. He doesn't want his son to go there, only the God of the heavens. Nita L'kei Haaretz. It's not the God of the earth. Since they don't have a recognition in the Eibishter, they don't recognize the Eibishter. Shmei HaKodesh is nit murgo b'frei abriyos, and Hashem's holy name is not accustomed in the mouth of the people. The river has been shama. Don't bring my son back there. Mashenk in Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to Eretz Yisrael, is a nitnor L'kei Hashemayim. Not his only God of heaven. He's the God of the earth. I have got him accustomed in the mouth of the people. On the other hand, is as dort nor in an efu for their galti bifi. I just trained them in the mouth. They hadn't penetrated them. Nitki shina mahus in the brias haven't changed their essence of the created being. In Zeiran hogus umaisim, their actions, they didn't change it. They were still only in their mouth. They speak of it. Was the that's why don't take from the daughters of the Canaanite that I live amongst them. Is there fun verstandig? So this we understand. As be'erech ma'alosif Yitzchak was his given an oila tmima. Relative to the mile of Yitzchak, who was an oila tmima, is choch is nita zoifil nageich shivasoretz. Although it's not so important the importance of the land, but in Eretz Atzma is noch nit given kemailam yuchedes in the land itself. There was not yet a special advantage. Noich nit in the hus von Ansher is also not the essence, not in the land, not in the people of the land. Is Beikir given shlila sayitzia. Mainly was the rejecting, don't go out. The far was in chutz loretz kedaylach. The chutz loretz is not fit for you. But dort is nitol lekei haaretz. Over there, there's no lekei haaretz. I feel the shmoyed nitrog the chutz loretz. Even Hashem's name is not accustomed in chutz loretz. So therefore, it's the not exposing you to the other places that don't have a chlala lekei hashemayim, And here it's only Befi, and therefore take away from there and bring it back over here. Zayin. Explain the two opinions, the approaches of the Medrash and Rashi in the inner matter of things. The Medrash halacha. According to the Medrash halacha is given the Bibles for Yidden of Eretz Yisrael. There was the ownership of Yidden over Eretz Yisrael, also in the time of the forefathers. Mitzad them, and because of that Yitzchak nid getorta rezgin, Yitzchak was not allowed to leave being an Eilot Mima. Can't go out of the Mechitza. Loit Pirish Rashi is nid given kebalas b'poil. According to Rashi, there was no ownership in actuality. That only accomplished, I think, Bnei Yisrael through the Yidden when they entered into the land in Eretz Yisrael. And the only reason why you should not leave Eretz Yisrael is blois only like that. Why does Rashi learn like this and the Medrash like this? Mitzad Medrash, from the approach of the Medrash, was his hecher from Shad, which is higher than sin, literally koil pashtus and yonim, which includes also the simple matter. It's higher than that. Nor verbunden mehr mit ruchnis in yonim, but rather it's tied and connected with spiritual matters. Aber das is negei poilech and gasel, but it's important. It connects and it impacts also in the physical world. Where the Bibles from Eden of Eretz Yisrael of Giton, so the ownership of the Yidden over Eretz Yisrael is accomplished through the saying of Hashem, which is action. Shenegeya to the Bibles from Eden of Eretz Yisrael, which connects and is important to the ownership of Eden of Eretz Yisrael. Loit Pirish Rashi Pshutish Mikra, however. So that more spiritual saying of Hashem connects you already, makes it yours. But Rashi Pshutish Mikra, we only consider how things are in the world of simple olam hamaisa, in the world of action, with the actual action. Vidos is in olam as it's in this world. The river, and therefore is euch the Bibles from Yidden of Eretz Yisrael geworden. Also the ownership for Yidden over Eretz Yisrael, that only happened dafke only durch their knisa v'kibush b'maisa, when they entered and they actually conquered it in actuality. Aber leidach, but on the other hand, durch der Maisa bepoiled from Yidden. But what happens is through the action that the Yidden took, they changes the muhusaretz, the essence of the land. And das wird is gala, and it is revealed the sinas hakadosh baruch hu from etzem muhusaretz, the giving of Hashem, that the essence Hashem gave over the land, it can never be taken. It's always there. It became a land of Israel, a land of the Yidden, an Eretz HaKodesh, a holy land. And in a constant way, Kiniska Leil, as mentioned earlier, this is Mesichas Chof Menachamov, Motzoi Shabbos Kedesh Re'ei in Tovshin Lamed Ches.